The dusty road stretched endlessly under the blazing midday sun as James Parker rode his motorcycle down Route 66. It wasn't the first time he'd passed through forgotten towns like this one, places where time seemed to have stopped decades ago. James, a man of quiet strength and discipline, was no stranger to hostile glares and unwelcome vibes. When he pulled up to Sally's diner, the only sign of life in this desolate stretch, he immediately noticed the row of motorcycles lined up outside. Their chrome gleamed under the sun, and the loud decals made it clear they belonged to a local biker gang. Unbothered, James parked his bike a little away from theirs, taking a moment to adjust his gear. He pulled off his helmet, revealing a face weathered by experience but calm as ever. The diner's neon sign flickered erratically, its promise of coffee and hot meals beckoning. Inside, James immediately felt the change in atmosphere. Conversations died mid-sentence, and heads turned to look at him. A group of bikers dominated the back of the diner, their presence as loud as the roaring engines of their bikes. Their leader, a burly man with a scruffy beard named Clayton, leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he noticed James. The waitress, a young woman with a nervous energy, darted behind the counter but forced a smile when James walked in. James scanned the room, noted the tension, and chose a booth in the corner, deliberately keeping his back to the wall. The waitress approached hesitantly, her eyes darting between James and the bikers. "What can I get you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Cheeseburger and coffee," James replied evenly, his deep voice calm and steady. As the waitress hurried away, James leaned back, taking in his surroundings. The bikers were making no effort to hide their disdainful glares or their whispered comments. James, however, remained composed. He wasn't here for trouble, just a meal and some rest before continuing his journey. The smell of sizzling burgers filled the air as James waited for his food, his gaze steady and unfazed by the stares of the bikers. They sat huddled together, their voices low but deliberately loud enough to carry across the room. "Doesn't look like he's from around here," one of them muttered, loud enough for James to hear. "Probably lost," Clayton sneered, "or stupid enough to think he belongs here." The others laughed, the sound grating and full of malice. James ignored them, keeping his focus on the table in front of him. His years in the Navy SEALs had taught him the value of self-control and restraint. He knew men like these, bullies who thrived on intimidation and fear. The waitress returned with his food, her hands trembling slightly as she placed the plate and cup in front of him. "Here you go," she said quickly, her eyes darting to the bikers and back to James. "Thank you," James said, his tone kind but firm. He took a sip of his coffee, savoring the warmth, and began eating. The bikers' mockery continued, growing louder and more aggressive. Clayton, emboldened by James's silence, decided to take it further. "Hey," he called out, his chair scraping loudly against the floor as he stood. The entire diner fell silent. "I'm talking to you." James didn't look up. He calmly finished his bite, wiped his mouth with a napkin, and set it down deliberately. Then, his gaze slowly met Clayton's. Clayton grinned, mistaking James's composure for submission. "You lost or something? We don't take kindly to strangers thinking they can just waltz in here." James's voice was steady, unyielding. "Just here for a meal." Clayton's grin faded, replaced by a sneer. He leaned closer, his hands gripping the edge of James's table. "Well, maybe you're in the wrong place for that." James didn't flinch, didn't even blink. The room felt charged, the air heavy with anticipation. The waitress hovered near the counter, her expression a mix of fear and concern. "Enjoy your meal," Clayton said mockingly, straightening up, but the malice in his eyes promised more to come. James took another sip of his coffee, his calm demeanor unshaken. He knew the storm brewing around him, but he also knew one undeniable truth. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The tension in the diner was as thick as the scent of sizzling grease and coffee grounds. Clayton, visibly irritated by James's calm response, sauntered back to his table, but his eyes never left James. The bikers chuckled, throwing jabs meant to rile him up, but James continued eating, methodical and unbothered. As James took his last bite, Clayton stood again, pushing his chair back with a loud scrape that made everyone in the diner flinch. He motioned to the others, and two of the bikers rose, flanking him like obedient lackeys. Together, they approached James's booth, their heavy boots thudding against the old wooden floor. James set his fork down, his movements deliberate. He wiped his hands with a napkin and looked up as Clayton towered over him. "You've got a lot of nerve, sitting here like you own the place," Clayton said, his voice dripping with menace. "I'm just eating my lunch," James replied evenly, his gaze meeting Clayton's without a hint of fear. Clayton leaned forward, planting both hands on the table, invading James's space. "This is my diner. My town. People like you don't belong here." James's expression didn't change, but his sharp eyes took in every detail. The clenched fists of the two men standing behind Clayton, the subtle shift in weight that signaled an impending attack. He had seen this before, countless times. Men who thought size and numbers gave them power. "I'm not looking for trouble," James said, his voice calm but firm. "Trouble's looking for you," Clayton spat. Without warning, he reached out to grab James by the collar. It happened in a flash. James's hand shot up, intercepting Clayton's wrist with a vice-like grip. In one fluid motion, he twisted the man's arm, forcing him to bend forward with a grunt of pain. Before anyone could react, James stood, using Clayton's own momentum to flip him onto the table with a resounding crash. Plates and cups clattered to the floor, and the room erupted in gasps. The other two bikers lunged forward, but James was already moving. He sidestepped the first, delivering a sharp elbow to the man's ribcage, sending him stumbling back, wheezing. The second threw a wild punch, but James caught his fist midair, twisting it until the man yelped in agony. A well-placed kick to the back of his knee brought him down. Clayton groaned, struggling to get up, but James calmly pressed a hand to his chest, pinning him to the table. "I said I'm not looking for trouble," James said, his voice low but commanding. "But if you insist, you won't like how it ends." The rest of the bikers at the table shot to their feet, chairs toppling over as they scrambled to confront James. Their leader's humiliation was too much to ignore, and they weren't about to let some outsider make fools of them. James released Clayton, letting him slump back onto the table, and turned to face the rest of the gang. The remaining 4 men advanced, their movements clumsy but brimming with aggression. One of them, a burly man with tattoos snaking up his arms, swung a fist the size of a small hammer toward James's face. James ducked effortlessly, his movements precise and controlled. The punch sailed harmlessly over his head, and before the man could recover, James delivered a swift strike to his solar plexus, sending him crumpling to the floor, gasping for air. Another biker charged at him, a knife glinting in his hand. The room collectively gasped, and the waitress let out a muffled scream. James sidestepped the attack, grabbing the biker's wrist and twisting it sharply. The knife clattered to the floor, and with a fluid motion, James flipped the man onto his back. "Stay down," James commanded, his voice as cold as steel. The remaining two hesitated, exchanging nervous glances. The reality of the situation was dawning on them. This wasn't a man they could intimidate or overpower. But fear mixed with pride is a dangerous cocktail, and they charged anyway, fists raised. James met them head-on. The first swung a heavy punch, but James blocked it effortlessly, countering with a palm strike to the man's jaw. The biker staggered back, his head spinning. The last attacker came in swinging wildly, but James sidestepped each blow with practiced ease, his movements almost graceful. A perfectly timed leg sweep sent the man sprawling to the ground. In less than 2 minutes, the fight was over. The bikers lay scattered around the diner, groaning in pain, their egos as bruised as their bodies. James stood in the center of the chaos, his breathing steady, his composure unshaken. The waitress clutched a tray to her chest, her wide eyes darting between James and the defeated bikers. The other diners sat frozen in their seats, the tension in the air giving way to a stunned silence. James calmly bent down to pick up his coffee cup, miraculously still intact, and returned to his booth. He sat down, taking a slow sip, as though nothing had happened. The only sound in the diner was the faint groans of the bikers as they tried to collect themselves. "Anybody else?" James asked, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. No one answered. The diner was utterly still, save for the labored breathing of the battered bikers sprawled across the floor and booths. Clayton, their leader, struggled to push himself upright from where James had pinned him moments before. His face was red with anger and humiliation, but the sharp ache in his wrist and ribs made him hesitate. The rest of his gang, usually so quick to jump into action, were groaning in defeat, their bravado crushed under James's calm, calculated efficiency. The waitress, still clutching her tray like a shield, moved closer to the counter, her wide eyes locked on James. The quiet man who had walked in just minutes earlier for a simple meal had dismantled the gang with a precision that left everyone speechless. Clayton finally staggered to his feet, swaying slightly. His pride demanded retribution, but his instinct screamed caution. James turned his head slowly, his piercing gaze locking onto Clayton. "Walk away," James said, his voice low and steady, carrying an unspoken promise of what would happen if the fight continued. Clayton's jaw clenched. He glanced around, taking in the wreckage. His men nursing their wounds, the shocked stares of the other diners, and the waitress trembling behind the counter. Every fiber of his ego demanded he retaliate, but deep down, he knew the truth. This wasn't a fight he could win. "Let's go," Clayton growled at his crew, his voice shaking with barely concealed rage. He turned to James one last time, pointing a finger at him. "You think this is over? You don't know who you're messing with." James didn't respond, didn't even flinch. He simply returned his attention to his coffee, taking another sip as though Clayton's threats were little more than background noise. The bikers limped and stumbled toward the exit, their heads low, their once dominant presence reduced to nothing more than a pitiful retreat. Clayton was the last to leave, slamming the door behind him with enough force to rattle the glass. The waitress finally exhaled, setting her tray down on the counter. The other diners began whispering among themselves, their voices a mixture of awe and disbelief. One older man sitting near the window leaned forward, his eyes still on James. "Who is he?" he muttered, but no one dared to answer. As the din of the bikers' retreat faded, the diner seemed to exhale collectively. The patrons began to shift in their seats, their hushed conversations buzzing with a mix of relief and wonder. James, unbothered by the attention, calmly resumed his meal. His composure was unshaken, his movements deliberate and precise, as if the chaos that had erupted moments ago was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. The waitress, finally mustering her courage, approached James cautiously. Are you okay?" she asked, her voice hesitant but tinged with gratitude. James looked up, his gaze softening slightly as he nodded. "I'm fine," he said. "Thank you." She fidgeted with her apron, glancing nervously at the mess left behind. "Your food, I can get you a fresh plate if you'd like. And coffee, on the house." James shook his head. "This is fine. Don't trouble yourself." The waitress blinked, clearly surprised by his calm demeanor. She gave a small nod before retreating to the counter, her steps lighter now that the threat had passed. Across the room, the other diners began to leave, casting furtive glances at James as they passed. Some murmured quiet thanks. Others simply gave him wide-eyed nods of acknowledgement. James didn't respond, his focus on finishing his meal. Outside, the distant rumble of motorcycle engines marked the bikers' reluctant departure. Clayton and his crew had slunk away, but the damage to their pride was far worse than the bruises they carried. By the time James finished his coffee and signaled for the check, the waitress was waiting with it, her hands no longer trembling. "That was," she hesitated, searching for the right words. "I don't think anyone's ever stood up to them like that before." James took the check, slipping a generous tip beneath it. He offered her a small smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Sometimes, it's better not to stand up at all. Let them fall on their own." The waitress blinked, her brow furrowing as she processed his words. But before she could respond, James stood, adjusted his jacket, and walked toward the door. As he passed the counter, the older man who had watched everything leaned closer. "Son," he said, his voice low, "I don't know who you are, but you just gave this town something to talk about for years." James paused, turning to meet the man's gaze. "I'm just a guy getting lunch," he said simply, then pushed the door open and stepped into the sunlight. The waitress and the older man exchanged glances as the door swung shut behind him. Outside, James climbed onto his bike, the sun catching the polished steel as he started the engine. With a low rumble, he rode away, leaving behind a diner full of people who would never forget the quiet man who had turned their world upside down. The air inside the diner hung heavy after James's departure, thick with tension and unspoken questions. The waitress began clearing the wreckage, her hands still trembling as she picked up shattered plates and scattered cutlery. The other patrons, slowly recovering from the adrenaline of the confrontation, murmured among themselves, dissecting every detail of what they had just witnessed. Outside, the bikers had regrouped in the parking lot. Clayton leaned against his motorcycle, a sour grimace twisting his face as he lit a cigarette. His knuckles were scraped, his pride battered even worse than his body. Around him, his crew nursed their bruises, exchanging low curses and glances of shame. "Who the hell does he think he is?" one of them muttered, clutching his ribs where James's precise elbow strike had landed. Clayton exhaled a plume of smoke, his jaw tightening. He didn't answer. The question gnawed at him too. Who was this stranger who had dismantled them so effortlessly? For years, Clayton had ruled this small town with an iron grip, the weight of his reputation enough to keep people in line. And now, with one calm but devastating display of skill, that reputation lay in tatters. "I'll tell you who he is," Clayton finally growled, his voice low but venomous. "He's nobody, just a lucky punk who'll get what's coming to him." But his bravado rang hollow. Deep down, Clayton couldn't shake the image of James's steady gaze, the way he'd handled the fight like it was a chore, not a challenge. It wasn't luck, and they all knew it. Inside the diner, the waitress hesitated as she wiped down James's booth. His untouched tip sat beneath the check, a neat stack of crisp bills far exceeding the cost of his meal. She picked it up, her eyes lingering on the spot where he had sat, as though hoping to understand the man who had upended everything in such a short time. At the counter, the older man from earlier finished his coffee, setting the cup down with a thoughtful sigh. "Quiet power," he murmured to no one in particular. The waitress, overhearing him, nodded slowly. "He didn't even look angry," she said, her voice soft. "Like, he didn't need to be." "That's the scariest kind," the man replied. "A person who knows their strength doesn't need to show it. He could have crushed them if he wanted, but he didn't." The waitress frowned, her fingers tightening around the bills. "But why didn't he?" The man shrugged, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Maybe he knew they weren't worth it. Or maybe he wanted to teach them a lesson." By the time James reached the next town, the story of what had happened at the diner was already beginning to spread. Word traveled fast in small towns, and a confrontation like this was ripe for exaggeration. At gas stations and convenience stores, the tale grew with every retelling. How a lone stranger had walked into Earl's diner and single-handedly taken down an entire gang of bikers. "He didn't even break a sweat," one local claimed, recounting the story to a gathering of listeners at the general store. "Took him apart like it was nothing. Heard he's some kind of special forces guy." "Special forces? More like a ghost," another chimed in. "Saw him ride off on that black bike of his, didn't say a word. Just vanished down the highway." The bikers, meanwhile, were left grappling with the fallout of their humiliation. Clayton, furious and desperate to salvage what remained of his authority, tried to spin the story in their favor. "Guy sucker punched us," he insisted to a group of loyalists who hadn't been at the diner. "Coward waited till we weren't ready. Next time, he won't be so lucky." But even his own men didn't look convinced. They had felt the cold precision of James's strikes, seen the unshakable calm in his eyes. The truth was clear. They hadn't been outnumbered or outmaneuvered. They'd been completely outclassed. Back at the diner, the waitress found herself at the center of the growing buzz. Strangers stopped by just to ask about the incident, their curiosity mingling with awe. "What was he like?" they asked her. "What did he say?" The waitress struggled to describe James. "He didn't say much," she admitted. "Just ate his lunch and left." But that simplicity only added to the mystique. A man who could defeat a gang of bikers without breaking a sweat and walk away as if nothing had happened. He was the kind of legend small towns thrived on. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the roads, James pulled into a gas station on the outskirts of the next town. A young cashier watched him warily as he filled up his motorcycle. "Hey," the kid called out hesitantly. "You that guy from Earl's Diner? The one who took on the bikers?" James glanced over, his expression unreadable. He considered the question for a moment, then shook his head. "Just a guy getting gas," he said simply. The cashier frowned, clearly unsure whether to believe him. But before he could press further, James had paid, climbed back onto his bike, and disappeared down the highway, leaving nothing behind but the faint echo of his engine. And so, the legend of the quiet stranger grew, a tale of strength, composure, and an unshakable will that no one who crossed his path would ever forget. As James rode further down the highway, the hum of his motorcycle mingling with the wind, he allowed his thoughts to drift. The fight at the diner wasn't the first time he had been confronted by prejudice, nor would it be the last. Years of military service had taught him the value of restraint, the wisdom in choosing battles that mattered and walking away from those that didn't. He wasn't angry. Anger was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not in the heat of combat, not in the face of adversity. Anger clouded judgment, and judgment was everything. His Navy SEAL training had instilled in him an unshakable principle: control is power. Not the reckless, loud power of bullies like Clayton, but the quiet, deliberate power that came from knowing yourself and your capabilities. He thought of the bikers, of their misplaced pride and insecurity. Their violence wasn't about him. It was about the fragile egos they had constructed, desperate to prove something to a world that had likely passed them by. In another life, maybe James would have pitied them, but pity wasn't what they needed. What they needed was a mirror, and in him, they'd seen one. The road stretched ahead, an unbroken ribbon of asphalt cutting through endless desert. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, its beauty a sharp contrast to the ugliness James had left behind. He wasn't running from the encounter. He was moving forward, as he always did. In the distance, a small town came into view, its lights flickering like fireflies against the encroaching night. James slowed his bike, the engine's growl softening as he approached a gas station on the outskirts. He needed water, a moment to pause before continuing his journey. James parked his motorcycle beside one of the gas pumps, the metallic clink of his kickstand echoing in the stillness. The station was quiet, save for the occasional chirp of crickets and the faint buzz of a neon sign advertising cold drinks. Inside, a young cashier sat behind the counter, scrolling through his phone. He looked up as James entered, his eyes briefly widening in recognition. Word had spread faster than James had anticipated. "You're the guy from Earl's Diner, aren't you?" the cashier asked, leaning forward on the counter. "The one who took down those bikers?" James didn't respond immediately. He moved to the refrigerated section, grabbed a bottle of water, and walked to the counter. Setting it down, he met the cashier's gaze with a calm intensity. "Just a guy getting water," James said, his tone neutral but firm. The cashier frowned, clearly unsatisfied with the answer. "But people are talking about you. They're saying you're some kind of hero or something. Special forces, maybe?" James scanned the young man's face, noting the mixture of curiosity and awe. He thought about the story the town would tell, how it would likely grow with each retelling until it bore little resemblance to the truth. "I'm just a guy who doesn't like bullies," James said after a pause. He slid a few bills across the counter, took his water, and turned to leave. The cashier watched him go, leaning slightly over the counter as if trying to absorb every detail of the enigmatic stranger. James stepped outside, the cool evening air washing over him. He unscrewed the bottle's cap, took a long drink, and gazed up at the darkening sky. The stars were beginning to emerge, tiny pinpricks of light in the vast expanse. For a moment, he stood still, the weight of the day dissipating into the night. Then, without ceremony, he climbed back onto his motorcycle, the leather seat familiar and grounding beneath him. The engine roared to life, its sound a declaration of movement, of purpose. As James rode away, the gas station and its curious cashier faded into the distance. The highway stretched before him, endless and open, a reminder that his journey was far from over. For those he left behind, the waitress, the bikers, the townsfolk, his presence would linger, a lesson in strength, humility, and the power of quiet control. But for James, it was just another stop on a long road, another moment that would become part of his past. The only thing that mattered was the road ahead, and as the stars guided him forward, he felt no need to look back. James rode on, the hum of his motorcycle blending seamlessly with the stillness of the desert night. For the people of that small town, his presence would become a story told over diner counters and campfires, a tale of quiet strength and unshakable composure. To the bikers, he was a mirror they couldn't avoid, forcing them to confront the hollow bravado they had hidden behind for years. But for James, it was just another day, another moment where his principles had guided his actions. He hadn't fought to prove himself or to make a statement. He had fought because sometimes, standing your ground was the only way to keep moving forward. In a world filled with noise, chaos, and bravado, James was a reminder of the power of silence, of discipline, and of self-respect. He didn't need to shout or boast to make an impact. His actions spoke louder than words ever could. As the highway stretched endlessly before him, James felt a sense of peace. His path wasn't defined by the battles he'd faced or the stories others would tell. It was defined by the choices he made, the choice to stand firm, to act with integrity, and to leave each place better than he'd found it. The stars above twinkled brighter as he disappeared into the horizon, a solitary figure bound not by glory or vengeance, but by purpose. And so, the legend of the man who walked into Earl's Diner grew, not because he sought fame, but because true strength has a way of leaving its mark. James wasn't a hero. He was simply a man on a journey, one who understood that the greatest battles are often fought within, and that real power lies not in dominance, but in knowing when to walk away. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to the entire story and watch the video. I hope you enjoyed it and found the messages meaningful. If you like this content, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share so you won't miss out on more exciting videos coming up. Your likes and subscriptions are the biggest motivation for us to keep creating and bringing you even more interesting stories. Thanks again, and see you in the next video.